That's great. Okay, maybe another 15 seconds and then we will get started. Okay, I think we have everybody. I'm just checking again on the policy roundtable. It looks like Mike is here, great. And Alan's back and Keith Ferdinand is, okay, I think we can go ahead and get started.
And Steve, Stacy's here. She's just not able to turn her camera on at the moment.
Okay, well, thanks for letting me know. All right, into the home stretch. Zoom makes this harder. I tell you, I do this portion of the meeting, many of you know when we're in person, I pace around. It helps me think, and I hate doing this standing here in front of my computer. I absolutely hate it. But if I sat, I would be dead by now, so I'm trying to stand up. So thank you for bearing with the Zoomness of all of this. We have a lot to talk about. We could do a whole policy roundtable on each of these drugs and not get to the bottom of the interesting issues. So we're going to try to do both drugs, and we are going to do both drugs, and we're going to try to cover a lot of different territory. Let's start by kind of introducing new members of the policy roundtable who will be with us. So here with their name and their conflicts of interest written out, we have the people, many of which you've already been hearing from: Kat Davis Ahmed, Andra Baer from the patient community. Now we've got a couple of payer representatives. I might as well start with them since Dave Bush is the next. But Dave, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself?
Sure, I hope you can hear me. I'm Dave Bush. I'm with Health Partners, which is out of Minnesota. And I have oversight of our health plan and our operations here at Health Partners.
Great. And we didn't plan it this way, but I think we've got somebody else sitting in the state of Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken. But Eric Schindler, who's with United Healthcare. Are you with us? I saw his name before.
Yeah, Steve, sorry about that. I was on mute. So yeah, Eric Schindler, clinical pharmacist with United Healthcare, responsible for the review and clinical development of clinical programs for specialty medications for our commercial book of business. And yes, United Healthcare is located in Minnesota, but I am working from home in St. Louis, Missouri. So Midwest time zone, but not in Minnesota.
That's good. That works out well. Actually, half of our Midwest CEPAC seems to be within an hour of St. Louis, I think. All right, and we've already had the benefit of working with Dr. Ferdinand and Dr. Varani, who continue to be with us. And representing the drug makers, we have David Platt and Mike Louie. Now, Mike, you introduced yourself during the public comments, but do you want to just say hi again so people can remember your face? I'm not sure if you're on mute, but I know Mike was also there.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Hi, everyone. I'm the Senior VP of Clinical Development and Pharmacovigilance at Esperion, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. And again, new to the roundtable conversation is David Platt. Dave, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Steve and panel. My name is David Platt. I serve currently as the head of Cardiovascular, Renal, and Metabolism Medical Unit, which is part of our U.S. Clinical Development and Medical Affairs group at Novartis. And thank you for the opportunity to join this esteemed panel.
Okay. Thank you guys all. And I won't be doing my job if I don't ask at least one question today that makes each of you very uncomfortable. Okay? That's my job. Just you know it's my job. It goes for the payers as well as the manufacturers and everybody else. Maybe not the patients, but sometimes they get one too. I want to start actually with sometimes something that gets left to the end. We had the vote on health inequity, the problem of health inequity, and how we might think about it in the introduction of these new treatments, in some ways with many new treatments. I'd love to come up with, what's the best strategy in this area with these new treatments coming into clinical practice? Let's assume that inclisiran will be approved. Are you okay with that, David?
I am. That's our assumption as well.
Let's assume that happens. What's the best strategy for us to use that as an opportunity to address health inequities in this area of treating ASCVD?
I'll go first.
Please do.
I still do not see any reason why it will not be positive in outcomes. I did hear some skepticism from my colleagues this morning. It works through the same basic pathway as the PCSK9 inhibitors. It has similar LDL lowering. I understood what Dr. Varani was saying about barriers if people don't have a usual place of care. However, the PCSK9 inhibitors are also somewhat difficult to use. You have to have prior authorization, although they've simplified it. You have to reinstitute prior authorization 2 to 3 times a month. The patients get tired of doing the self-injections. If the patient doesn't come in for a visit, then they're not getting evaluation of the other risk factors and screenings and general health evaluation. So I think it ties the person into the usual care setting. They get that primary care visit, which I think is one of the great markers to decrease disparities. If you go to the Agency for Healthcare Policy Review, you look at the data. In terms of Paul Muntner's last paper on blood pressure, you choose the metric and I'll show you the outcome. People who have a identifiable source of primary care and have insurance do better than those who don't. So if you can build it into having a medical home and that person coming in and getting that shot, you'll reduce LDLs, you'll get the chance for other health screenings and other risk factor modifications, and I think it would help.
All right, so I'm just noting, and Dr. Varani, I'll let you chime in too, but I'm just noting that certainly from your perspective, Dr. Ferdinand, from some or many patients, having the administration of the treatment be folded into the care in the doctor's office is a way to reduce inequities because it allows the doctor and that
do other
office
things
to kind of do everything at once, if you will, and not get.
Yeah, and I understood, Dr. Ronnie, there's a barrier for some doctors with travel, cost of travel, et cetera, but they got to go to the doctor anyway. If you don't go to the, forget doctor, if you don't go to the healthcare provider anyway, you're going to miss other things, control of diabetes and blood pressure and screenings for colon cancer. I mean, there's just a lot that goes into getting evaluated on a regular basis. And if we can develop that, then that's a good thing. Now, of course, the clinics or the doctor's office or the provider is going to probably look for something for cost of administration. And that has to be factored in. I don't know how you do that. I'm not a health economist, but I think that overbears the benefit of having an identifiable source of care.
Yeah, no, I actually fully agree with you, Dr. Ferdinand, and you have, of course, done a lot of work in this space. I hope I can even understand all the work that you've done over the years. So you would be the best person. I think what I raised was a flag, not to say that that would be the case. And as you know better than any of us here, that a lot of it, you know, these disparities exist not just because of the patient, they exist because of the healthcare system, they exist because of us as clinicians having that systemic racism as well. I think we have to be very open about it, right? Sometimes therapies differ based on the patient that's in front of you. So I hope that when these new therapies come out, there's a lot of work, not just looking at the access piece, which I think is very important, but in addition, looking at it that if you have a female with ASCVD sitting in front of you, if you have an African-American patient sitting in front of you, if you have a Hispanic sitting in front of you, care should not vary based on who is sitting in front of you. If treatment intensification needs to be done, it should be done. And that clinical inertia that we have, that should not be a differential clinical inertia. And I think that's where once these medications are available, if those can be addressed, I think they would go a long way. The other aspect of this, since we're in a roundtable here, we're talking about ideas. I mean, if you look at our healthcare system in our country, it's very different from some of the other countries. For in our country, patients have to come to the healthcare system to get care. I think the best way to deliver care is to take it where the patient is. And of course, you are a champion, right? When we talk about all these barbershop study for hypertension, why can we not have the same kind of models for lipids care delivery as well? And I think that's when we ought to be thinking about it, not as a 1 year, 2 year solution, but more as a 5 to 10 year solution to take it where
last statement, which builds on that. I was speaking in shorthand when I said usual source of care. The usual source of care could be the home, it could be the community center, it could be the church, but somebody evaluate that patient. And if they would even pay for it to be delivered to the person's home or to their church or to their community center and do the shots there, that's fine. This thing is so bad, and I don't want to go, I'm going to give you one more minute. This thing is so bad that even with COVID-19 vaccinations, the disparities are showing up where Black and Latinx patients are getting immunized less. There's more hesitancy, but there's also travel, how to locate where you get in on the internet, having a smartphone, be able to receive the information, etc. And it is so bad that in New York, Los Angeles, New Orleans, middle age and younger white people of means are getting vaccinated more than sick older Black people. It's just, it's a terrible situation how structurally our system doesn't work.
Yeah. Sadly, a lot of people were able to say ahead of time that they could have put money on that being the outcome in our system, and it sure is playing out that way, sadly. Dr. Ferdinand, let me stay with you because I'm going to have some patient-related questions in a second too. But from a public health perspective, some people would say if you were given $10 million right now, would you spend it on new treatments at the high end, or would you plow it into getting statins into the community and treating 90% of patients who should be on statins instead of 10 to 30% or whatever it might be? And I mean, is there a risk in our system in particular where the incentives often drive towards the marketing and both to clinicians and to patients of the newer, more expensive options? Are we going to potentially miss an opportunity to reduce health inequities by somehow ramping up our efforts on statins? Or do you think the two come hand in hand?
Well, statins are the baseline for all of these therapies, whether they be PCSK9 inhibitors, inclisiran, bempedoic acid, statins first. But the disparities are there with the statins already. The reason I say usual source of care, I talked about the clinic, the doctor's office, and I backed off by Dr. Varandi's suggestion. It may be the home, it may be the community center, it may be the church. But you have to touch the patients. You have to have the patients know that you care for them. The reason the disparities persist are the social determinants, the structure, not having insurance or being uninsured, not having access to care, not having transportation, living in food deserts. These things are all very predictable. So then you have COVID-19 vaccination, and you take this very effective way of preventing a deadly disease, but you build it into a system that's already dysfunctional, and you get the same outcomes. A lack of uptake of this life-saving intervention because of those problems. So if I had $20 million, I'd make sure everybody had insurance, take that off the table. Then I'd make sure everybody had an identifiable source of care, take that off the table. And then I would make sure that in those particular settings where travel was a barrier, health beliefs were a barrier, I would go to their house, I would go to their community center, I would go to their church, I'd give them whatever I do. I'd give them the statins for free, I'd give them the blood pressure medicines for free. I would give them generic metformin. I'd do whatever I could to at least initiate cardiovascular risk reduction. And that's what's being done in middle income and low income countries, where they don't wait because they don't have enough doctors for people to show up in the clinic. They go out to the community health workers, promontories, lay health workers. And this has been reported in New England Journal of Medicine, in Thailand, in India, where you go to the community, you measure, you treat, you give the people the medicine, and that's better than waiting for them to show up in the clinic. So give me $20 million, I give everybody insurance, I give them all the identifiable source of care, I go out and find where you can treat patients where they are. Inclisiran may have the benefit that it forces us to do something in terms of giving the patients a link. Bempedoic acid, maybe not so much, because it's still a pill that you got to go somewhere and get a prescription and get a refill and then get a follow-up visit. It becomes a little bit more complicated. But last sentence, 1 minute. These disparities are the reason the life expectancy in the United States is 16th among developed societies. If you have money, if you live in a structurally sound environment, your life expectancy is the same as Japan and Western Europe. The reason we're 16th in life expectancy is because of disparities. That is the reason. It's not a side story. It is the actual explanation of the poor outcomes in the United States. Those of us with means, we do fine.
Thank you. Well said. And we will be sure to capture that. It reminds me a little bit, actually, when we had a meeting long ago now, it seems, on hepatitis C treatments when they were coming through. And we had the medical director for LA County. And I asked him, so what's the first thing on your mind in terms of which treatment to pick for your patients. He said, no. The first thing on my mind is, can I find them housing? That's what I have to focus my first visit with the patient. I can't pick which hepatitis C treatment to use. I have to figure out whether I can get them housed, and then we'll worry about those things later. So the bigger picture is really, really, really helpful and important. So let's keep that in mind as we talk about these other issues too. Kat and Andrea, I actually wanted to give you a chance to, because we have talked a lot about FH in ways throughout the course of the day, different votes on the evidence, as you noted, different votes on the value with the subpopulations there. But I know from your perspective, what would be the top 1, 2, or 3 things you would want to have happen in the setting of care for patients with FH to advance their interests? I understand that just diagnosis is still a major stumbling block.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I think it flows nicely from the conversation we've just been having, and a comment that I think that Rima made earlier in the day. We do hope that these moments where there are new, exciting, innovative therapies coming on the market might be a moment also to raise awareness, not just of FH. LDL is a driver of cardiovascular risk, and it's underappreciated and undertreated across the board, not just in FH at all, certainly among people with ASCVD. So I would hope that this would be a moment where we raise the profile of LDL as a driver of cardiovascular risk, and all of our opportunities to lower it. The earlier, the better, and to improve the uptake of statins first for everybody, and to take an approach at first that we think of how not to perpetuate disparities in our new approach. And I think that insurance companies and PBMs have a really important role, and of course health systems do, in really prioritizing that. And I'll just say it's something we would love to work with them on, is to find people and get them on first line therapy. And then you find out who needs second, third, fourth, fifth line therapy, and save your resources there. But right now we just wait until people are in dire circumstances. So that's what I would like to see, is let's find people earlier, be more proactive, and get them on the therapies we have in our arsenal.
All right, thanks. Andrea, anything you'd like to add?
No, I agree. And I think that awareness and diagnosis is really the first step. And because you can't treat it unless you know it's there. And so that would definitely be the first line. And statin therapy can work well for a lot of people if they even have tried it. And there's a lot of people that have not even been put on any statins because they haven't even explored the possibility that their LDL is high.
Yeah. I think there was actually a campaign a couple of years ago, Know Your LDL or something. Maybe it's still going on, but it's something, like know your blood pressure, know your LDL, that kind of thing. So I think that'll be important to note. Okay, so let me then drop, at least for a minute, into a drug specific set of questions, and then some of the coverage issues will be the same for both. Step therapy and things will have their own wrinkle. But I want to talk first a little bit about bempedoic acid based on kind of the review of the evidence today and some of the votes. It was interesting because when we started this review, bempedoic acid, when we talked to clinical experts, not just the two who are with us today, but a wider variety and some health plans and others, and we started to get a pretty wide variety of opinions, just their own take on the evidence and what was happening. And some of them were honestly not that excited about it because they didn't feel that the LDL decrement was that exciting. They kind of just didn't see it was going to have that much of a role in therapy. Others were very excited. They thought, especially for the statin intolerant patients, but maybe for others, it provided a really important other option. And there are always going to be barriers to injectables one way or the other. So we heard a real wide variety of opinions. And I'm wondering from the clinical experts, if you had to kind of in a nugget say, what do you expect the role in therapy of bempedoic acid to end up looking like? Maybe not today, but a year or two from now. What do you think? Where do you think it's going to settle out? Of course, we don't know the clinical outcomes yet. So everybody has to just acknowledge that once those come in, the cards get reshuffled and who knows what'll happen. But if you had to forecast, at least in the short term, maybe even, what do you think the role in therapy of it? Are most clinicians going to sit on the sidelines, or is there going to be a big rush to using this for a lot of patients? Dr. Virani, what do you think?
I had to guess right now, I think the drug will find a good niche, and I think that's going to be your patients with statin intolerance. I think you will definitely see it will be picked up because it's a medication by mouth. Side effects are there, but overall, I think they're manageable. So I think what will happen, again, it's a guesstimate, is that patients, especially secondary prevention patients, where there's some hesitancy to not go to injectables, I think that's where ezetimibe, bempedoic acid will definitely fill in that gap, because when you combine the two, or start with statin therapy and stepwise add one or the other, whichever that might look like in the future, you can get to a very decent level of LDL cholesterol. So I believe that that is going to be the area. And if you don't have statin therapy because you're statin intolerant, then I think if you start out at 120, 130, and if you're able to get by going to these two medications and get to a 35% LDL cholesterol reduction, that can be pretty much like a moderate intensity statin therapy, which we know works in secondary prevention as well. I think that's where I think things will start out with first, and you will find some interest.
Okay. Dr. Fernand, any different opinion?
No, I think the statin intolerant patient, in my early remarks, while it's not approved by the FDA as an indication, and it's really not an acceptable definitive condition, but the statin associated side effects are very common, 10%, 15% or greater. So it becomes an alternative. It's in the same pathway of the statins without giving the muscle problems. The liver enzyme elevations, we need to watch cautiously. I heard that this morning, but I don't think that's going to end up being a problem. The uric acid can be monitored. The tendon rupture may be just an outlier. I'm not really sure of any pathophysiologic mechanism by which it would cause that problem. In patients with FH, they need every and anything you can do. So if they can't tolerate the maximum doses of statins, which have been shown in outcome studies, bempedoic acid becomes an alternative. I've already used it in patients with FH. The reason I spoke so deeply about this whole thing of patients with or without clinical cardiovascular disease was not only that 55-year-old guy, but the 40-year-old woman who I saw 2 weeks ago who had an LDL 260, 250. And we went on and imaged her, not with any invasive, but just with ultrasound, and she already had plaque. So this idea of with or without cardiovascular disease in patients with FH and LDLs that are over 200 just doesn't make any sense. It's a misunderstanding of how the disease presents itself. They need to be treated whatever they can be treated with. So clearly with FH, it's going to be beneficial. And clearly for those patients who have statin-associated side effects, you don't want to use the term statin intolerance, it becomes an alternative. I think it'll work.
All right, so Mike, there you are. So are you ready for that first uncomfortable question? Yes. Here it comes. All right, so let me just put myself into this hypothetical room somewhere in your company. And they're looking at numbers that say that if 10% of the population feels like it can't take statins, we're going to make X amount. If 20% of the population thinks that they can't take statins, we're going to make twice as much, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, they're dependent upon how many patients and doctors feel like they can use statins. How are we to feel like the competitive landscape is going to make it anything but impossible for you not to try to subtly sell the idea that statins are going to create problems for people? Don't worry about, any kind of pushing through or trying a different statin. Move to the new non-statin option. Break through. I think one of the ads I've seen is you've got a doctor breaking through a jungle in which muscle symptoms is holding him back. It's a great visual. How do we as a country address this issue that we've got very low priced treatments, which we know are effective, and we know that there will be some patients for whom they can't take those, and yet we've got this kind of economic incentive to drive that number up? How do you see that?
Well, first of all, I would say that we have no interest in, getting patients who should be on statins, not on statins or not intensifying their statins. I think the issue with statin intolerance is, as we heard from some of our patient representatives, is that it's a difficult condition to have, a difficult condition to diagnose, and a difficult condition to treat. So, we merely are just based on our mechanism of action, has been brought up by Dr. Ferdinand and others, we're a prodrug that's not active in skeletal muscle, and therefore a lot of the symptoms of statin intolerance are similar to placebo in terms of skeletal muscle. We are not indicated, as was mentioned, for statin intolerance. We're indicated on top of maximally tolerated statin, which can be no statin at all. But it's not really in our interest to try to magnify the condition of statin intolerance. I think it's already an under-recognized problem and difficult to diagnose. I think those are the only aspects about it that we would focus on.
Thank you for handling my difficult question with the grace that you just did, because I think that it's obvious that you will make more money the more people who think that they can't take statins. And yet I think we hope that you certainly view yourselves as part of a broader effort to get patients on appropriate treatment at a cost effective, because that still should leave, I would think, a healthy population that could be considered for treatment with bempedoic acid. We're going to talk about how payers kind of operationalize some of these terms in a bit, but just to briefly bring in, maybe Dave, can I ask you to, Dave Bush from Health Partners. From your health plan's perspective, when you see the treatment bempedoic acid coming in, and I know when we talked to you, you had already taken a look at the evidence on your own. How did you view its role in therapy, and how do you view this issue of its relative role in patients who have statin symptoms?
I think, as we step back, first of all, looking at treatment guidelines, comparative trials, information that's out there. Obviously, we're looking for safety and effectiveness first and foremost in our treatment. Relative to, the therapies themselves, what I would say is that, we are trying to create, choices within our formulary that align with our treatment guidelines. And so when you look at, say, bempedoic acid relative to cost and relative to PCSK9s or PCSK9 therapy, from a cost perspective, the PCSK9s are probably more effective than what we see as bempedoic acid. And our preference would be going more down of a PCSK9 preference versus a bempedoic acid. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. If you look at it from a treatment perspective, again, our preference is to go down more of a PCSK9 therapy. But if a patient is intolerant to statins, in all reality, they have a choice between one or the other. And if you look at, if you were to look at our community, there's very low use and uptake of the bempedoic acid as well.
So just to be clear, if it's possible, to this level of specificity, the PCSK9 label and the bempedoic acid label are very, very similar, as you probably know. So
You're
in your
breaking up, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, no.
Okay, maybe there was some background noise. The labels for PCSK9s and for bempedoic acid are very, very similar. They both talk about just adjunctive therapy, if they need LDL lowering with secondary ASCVD on maximally tolerated statins. I guess my question was, based on what you said, would your formulary actually prefer that a patient go straight to PCSK9s and not have a go at bempedoic acid, even if they needed another 15%, lowering of their LDL? Or, would you look at it in that kind of degree of trying to figure out how far they needed to move to get to target? Or would you just say everyone should just jump straight to PCSK9s after maximally tolerated statins?
Yeah, in all reality, that is how we have structured our preferences and our formulary. We just see the value of bempedoic acid as being relatively low, and the evidence and outcome information for the PCSK9s is, I would say, has been much better than bempedoic acid, and therefore we prefer going down the route of a PCSK9.
Okay. I mean, I usually would end up just towards the latter part of our hour, but now I feel like I have to ask Eric, just for interest's sake. How do you view the role in therapy of bempedoic acid, and has it led to a tiering or a formulary that sounds similar to that or very different?
Well, thanks, Steve. And I would agree with a lot of what Dave said. I think that within our policy, both PCSK9, bempedoic acid, and probably how we will review inclisiran, we try to take a relatively consistency in approach in evaluating them. Obviously, the ACC, AHA guidelines have, been published and updated, and they definitely, promote statin therapy, a comment for ezetimibe therapy, and then if not to goal with either of those, they go to the PCSK9 inhibitors because of outcomes data. And so understand that the outcomes data is going to, that the PCSK9s have is definitely an advantageous position for them. But we understand that there will be patients who do not tolerate statin therapy, have gone through multiple statin trials, have gone through numbers of physicians and specialists who really understand the implications of not taking a statin, and they may decide to stick with an oral therapy where bempedoic acid could be an option. So we're relatively agnostic to what that decision would be in that either, you could say, third line state or in a statin alternative state. So if through shared decision making they go to a bempedoic acid type therapy, that would be reasonable, and it's a preferred tier 2 branded medication for us.
Mm-hmm.
But understand for those who would go, follow evidence-based medicine with outcome reduction, would understand how PCSK9s would come into the decision there. And so we essentially have both pathways open currently.
Okay. Again, I feel like I'm, sure, Dr. Varani, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to make one thing. Clinically, what is very relevant is that statin-associated side effects or statin intolerance, whatever we're going to call it, is not a yes-no kind of answer. There's a relative spectrum where a large number of patients may be able to take some form of statin therapy as well. So then I think it gets to how far are you from where you want your patient to be. And I think that may drive it as well. So it's not going to be just no statin versus, yes statin. It's going to be the spectrum. So there could be some patients who are actually good candidates because they can only tolerate a very low intensity of statin therapy as well. Yeah.
Steve, I was just going to comment too, and I think Eric made a good point. If we have a patient who does not want to, inject, an oral therapy. So if they are used to using any of the oral therapies and don't want to go down the route of an injection, we're not going to say no to a patient who meets the criteria and wants an oral therapy versus going down an injection. So I think, given our preference for a PCSK9, if there's reason to go with oral, and it's going to make that patient adherent to the therapy, we will, approve a therapy like that.
Would it be an exception in that case?
Absolutely.
It would be. Okay. All right. And we are going to I want to come back to the statin intolerance language, actually, that you guys have used, or that we can think of different options for and what we can learn from that. But I want to give Dave Platt now a chance. Actually, we've been not talking about inclisiran for a while. We hope that COVID gets better for all the reasons that we want in the world, partly because that will allow the FDA to get over to Italy, right? And get you guys, get your factories checked out over there. My question for you is something that puzzled us from day one, and it's got everybody waiting to hear, how are you guys going to deliver this through the delivery system? Will it be something that if a PBM wants to have patients learn how to self-administer twice a year at home, they can do so? Or will you really only make it available in a way that clinicians can use it in the office and somehow not be available in any other way? Can you explain how if you can't tell us what you're going to do, at least explain to us the way that you're going to make that decision, perhaps?
Sure, Steve. And, listening to the discussion earlier, this was one topic that I was hoping we would get into. So when you think about the dosing schedule, for inclisiran, day 0, day 90, and then twice yearly administration subsequently. That's a pretty infrequent dosing frequency. And so we believe that's much more suitable to a healthcare provider administration versus a patient, because you have to imagine patients would have to relearn how to administer the drug every time, and these long durations in between would make that very difficult. And so we intentionally studied inclisiran as an HCP administered product. We also believe that's going to give us the opportunity to address many of the patient adherence issues, right? Especially that we've talked about already in patients with comorbidities like diabetes and hypertension, which carry a burden of polypharmacy. And we also know that those twice yearly injections will line up relatively well with the usual visits that ASCVD patients are already making to their healthcare providers. Right. So that's the rationale behind why we studied the drug this way, and we didn't study patient administration. So when it comes to how we address some of those challenges, though, to your point, our aim is really to partner with healthcare systems on ASCVD management to overcome those non-clinical barriers you just talked about to tackling the disease at scale. And we're using the opportunity of the time between now and the approval to really advance the engagement that we're having with healthcare systems, so we can set up all of that needed infrastructure to make it possible for healthcare providers to deliver inclisiran to the appropriate patients and meet patients where they are, just like we were talking about earlier and Dr. Ferdinand talked about so eloquently.
Okay, so I asked Dr. Louie an uncomfortable question about how the system, how our economic incentives work. So you're working with doctors who can get paid something for administering this drug, whereas for PCSK9s, they don't. They hand it off and it goes home. How do we avoid this becoming a kind of pay-to-play situation where doctors prefer inclisiran primarily because they can get paid for it? We heard reasons from Dr. Ferdinand, that doctors may prefer it because they feel like they can capture the other aspects of preventive care as part of that kind of visit if they do it that way. And I'd invite the payers to comment too. Is this something that's on your radar? Are you going to try to block the providers from charging you this, or do you think it's such peanuts that it's not going to be a big deal? You'll just factor it in to the price, but how are you going to manage this in terms of the doctor administration fee as part of the thinking here? Maybe payers, you could first. Yeah, go ahead. Eric, what do you think?
I'll jump in and think it's like, I completely agree with everything that Dave said about how it ties in nicely with the patient care experience with the follow-up. But I think we also need to acknowledge, a phenomenon that we see with multiple Part B drugs, even though this isn't a subcutaneous injectable medication, it's not necessarily an infusion, but on the commercial setting, when we see, offices not necessarily do the administration and then they will refer their patients to an outpatient infusion center or an outpatient administration center, that then all of a sudden the dynamics of reimbursement is it takes a drug that's $10 and all of a sudden it's around $25 or $30. 2.5, threefold markup is not unheard of in the outpatient channel, which is unfortunate and obviously would skew any of the analysis and calculations that we've discussed at length already today. I hope that's not the case. I hope this is something that could stay into a physician's office where reimbursement models are not as exorbitant or not as are within a more finer range that still gives physicians significant reimbursement for their time. So yeah, that's definitely we're aware of, but I think it's still in the abstract because we haven't seen it yet, but it's a phenomenon that we have seen historically.
David, any reaction to that?
No, I would agree with that.
I'm sorry. No, there are two Davids. I should David Health Partners and then David Novartis. Go ahead.
Okay. I would agree with Eric. It's definitely on our radar. I think safety, we want to make sure that the drug is used safely, from as long as the drug is managed well through that channel. I can tell you that it's probably from a overall management perspective, it's easier to do it through a pharmacy benefit channel. But at the same time, we want to make sure that, the medications are administered appropriately as long as we're not seeing, abuse or, overcharging. That's something we're just going to have to manage over the long term.
So can I intuit from you what you said, that do you think most insurers will try to keep this on the pharmacy benefit side as opposed to the medical benefit?
Sorry.
Personally,
Go ahead, Eric.
I would say United Healthcare would not. With any drug that gets approved for healthcare administration only, we keep that on the medical benefit, but we do so because we have the benefit of an integrated benefit design where we control both medical and pharmacy. Certain plan sponsors where it has maybe a segmented medical and pharmacy benefit, there could be two different perspectives from the two different benefit designs.
And that's exactly the same for us. We have oversight of both medical and pharmacy benefit, and we would not change putting it into a pharmacy channel unless it was not considered a medically administered drug or a professionally administered drug.
And how will patients feel the difference? If it's pharmacy versus medical, do you expect that there would be a higher out-of-pocket payment for patients on one versus the other?
Well, it depends on how the benefit is designed, is what I would say. I don't know if I could necessarily comment on that. Each benefit will be designed differently. And I would say that from a pharmacy benefit perspective, it's probably easier to manage. It's easy for the patient to get a prescription and administer it. The downside of a medical or a professionally administered drug is they have to go into a doctor's office, have it administered. Do they have to pay a copay to go into the doctor? Every benefit is uniquely different.
Okay.
I would agree with that, Steve. And I think the last PBMI report on specialty plan design would suggest that for the most, majority of medical benefit designs is a co-insurance model, whereas pharmacy may be a flat, copay. And so, when we had the discussion of potential disparities in care, is that if this, if estimates are, a $3,000 single administration, 20% of that is not benign for someone who may have certain, monetary restrictions. So that was something that I went to when you were talking about potential disparities in care. But I also could appreciate the fact of a single administration that coupled with their physician office visit. So it's just, I'm not sure what the end result will be, but it's something to take into consideration.
Thank you. Kat and Andrea, I'm sure you guys maybe have heard some of this or thought about it deeply as well, but clearly this is something, since it's still kind of to be determined as inclisiran works through the system. I would think that there could be important differences for patients in terms of their out-of-pocket experience, although I'm sure that Novartis is thinking about this, and what the last thing they want is for it to be good for the doc, but bad for the patient, and end up kind of misaligning incentives in different ways. Right, David? Yeah, okay. Let's go to some of the specifics that often drive people crazy. And this is the language that insurers will use to define the lovely terms in the FDA label that are kind of Rorschach tests. So there is, I'm assuming again that inclisiran's label will look somewhat like PCSK9s and bempedoic acids. So let's start with the idea that these are for patients who need additional LDL lowering despite maximally tolerated statin therapy. So we've talked about statin intolerance below. What I'd love to have a short conversation about is, how has this been operationalized amongst insurers in the United States? What's the variation in the way that insurers are defining statin intolerance? We've heard two different statins maybe 2 different statins times 3 months each. Maybe it's more, maybe it's less. Maybe it's just a doctor ticking a box saying, yeah, they tried and I can attest that they didn't do well with it. And again, I'm sure that the manufacturers have been looking into this to understand the landscape. But who would like to start with their view of the variation that's been seen? And then we ought to try and figure out what some of the best practices might be, or at least the options, because we're not making policy here, but we want to at least frame what some of the options are that we think that insurers will be considering when they write the language, the deep language, if you will, around how they are going to decide whether the patient has had maximally tolerated statins. Anybody want to start with variation? Eric, I know you personally were very involved in the PCSK9 coverage criteria for United Healthcare, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm sure you've thought about this and heard about it from other insurers perhaps, but what's your view on the variation out there?
Yeah, well, thanks for remembering that, Steve. It's been quite a journey. So I think what in our policy, we've attempted to follow pretty much in lockstep with what the ACC, AHA guidelines, were when PCSK9 inhibitors were approved, and then followed with the various decision pathway updates they had in 16, 17, and then updated in 2018. And kind of how we started from a spot, and it was, I think, similar with what the National Lipid Association talked of back in, 14, 15 was, it was trial of 2, trial of 3, and re-challenge. That was years ago. But when we really looked at the most recent ACC, AHA guidelines, and the ones that predated it, it was coupled of, it was high intensity statin therapy with a target LDL reduction of 50% or greater. And then couple that with, statin exposure, we knew that if they are supposed to be on a high intensity statin and they couldn't tolerate that, and then they went to a moderate or a low intensity statin, specifically a moderate, and they didn't tolerate that, having them go to a low or even to a moderate, they weren't going to approach that 50% reduction. So we knew that either by tolerability or efficacy, they weren't going to meet that first requirement of a target LDL reduction of 50%. So we have modified our policy to essentially, and consistent with what I think most of the clinical trials say, it's an inability to tolerate 2 statin trials. And if it goes down to that pathway, then that meets the definition and goes to the next step in the process. We do emphasize the use of Zetia, but not necessarily as a collective 100% step therapy is what's been talked about in the earlier this morning. We acknowledge that the Zetia efficacy is roughly 20 to 25% of an LDL lowering. So if somebody's baseline LDL, on maximum tolerated statin therapy, which could be 0 statin therapy, is greater than 25% above the target, we don't require that Zetia challenge, or ezetimibe challenge. Sorry for using the brand name. But yeah, so with our statin tolerability, it's essentially a trial of 2 agents, no requirement for retrial, because we understand once you've gone to that second moderate or low intensity statin pathway, you're not going to get to 50% by itself.
Thanks. And do you require documentation of the 2 trials somehow, or just physician attestation of 2 trials?
We do review claim evidence for that. And so we'll look at the claim history. And if it's in the claim history, that suffice. If it's not, if they happen to get it through, one of the free $4 non-adjudicated through the insurance system, a medical note from the physician would suffice.
Okay. Dave, any notable differences in how you've done it or how you've seen other insurers approach this?
No. So for us, it would be 2 statins as well. And, from a failure perspective or intolerance, we will look at our claims history as well. But if it's, if we don't have it in claims history, we will ask for, information from the physician, just stating that, 2 statins have been used.
Okay.
So,
Is the
our
way-
criteria wouldn't be any different.
All right. The way this gets actually operationalized, I assume that if the request goes in and you can't find the claims history for 2 trials, you'll do an initial denial. And so then it will have to go back to the clinician who will have to then put in the information as an attestation, or is there no denial that's kind of part of that process?
Well, we will do our due diligence on it, you know, so I mean, if we try to streamline the process as much as possible through, you know, looking at our claims. But, you know, if we don't have, you know, if we need more information, we will go back to the clinician and say, has there been 2 statins used, you know, just to validate our criteria.
Okay. Kat or clinical experts, and Kat, I'm asking you partly because I figure that you will have heard a wide variety of good, bad, and ugly when it comes to these kinds of issues around how statin intolerance is operationalized across many different insurers. Is there anything else that you think we should include in our report as something to learn from that variation or something to suggest as a best practice?
Well, my question would be, are we also going to talk about the other criteria for who meets the other criteria, you know, for ASCVD or for hypercholesterolemia? And I saw that Dr. Louie has a question. So because I think I might have more to say about the other criteria.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to ASCVD. What is established ASCVD or clinical ASCVD? So Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, Steve, I know if you just kind of do a literature search, you'll find so many different definitions of statin intolerance, right? But I think the professional organizations are really converging now on being more patient-centric in how you define it. Basically, if a patient feels they have statin intolerance, it's almost kind of cruel to force them to go through 5 different statins and have the same symptoms over and over. I just wanted to mention, you know, we are conducting CLEAR Outcomes, our cardiovascular outcomes trial, which is only in statin intolerant patients. And in the protocol that we agreed to with the FDA, statin intolerance has 2 possible definitions. One that Eric and David said, you know, inability to tolerate 2 or more statins at any dose, but also inability to tolerate 1 statin at any dose and unwilling to attempt a second statin or advised by a physician not to attempt a second statin. So, you know, this definition, I think, it kind of calls into mind the patient centricity of this condition and also is easy to operationalize and doesn't force patients through unnecessary repeats of these muscle symptoms.
All right. Andrew, did you have something to say too? Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I just like to kind of piggyback off of what Mike had said about, you know, when we're talking about patients, I think that sometimes patients get a bad rap of this whole statin intolerance, like they're evil patients and they just don't want to listen to the doctor. But from experience, not with statins, but other medications, those long-term months after months, and then you try something else and it doesn't work. And how many people just quit? How many people just don't go back to the doctor and say, look, I'm just not even going to do this. I'll just let my LDL get, you know, be whatever it is, because I don't want to have to fight this. And I'm wondering if we streamline to at least a situation where we start with the statin. If it's not working, we don't need to make them suffer for 6 or 8 or 9 more months trying, you know, a whole bunch of different things and paying more copays every time they go back to the doctor. Can, you know, we just say, okay, so we can't do this. Let's try something that might work. I just think that we lose a lot of patients when we try to force them into this way of doing things in this step therapy, that it just makes, I mean, we have people all the time that just say, well, I can't take a statin and I'm not doing it. So what do we do then with those patients?
Right. I mean, this is a tension that's been around ever since, well, there was something other than statins, I guess, to use. And as you know, the tension is driven by the fact that a year of statins versus a year of a PCSK9 is still a pretty big difference in cost. Bempedoic acid is going to be an interesting new angle to this, but it's especially before we have the clinical outcomes, people are going to be able to make an argument that, you know, bempedoic acid and inclisiran are in a slightly different category. But it's not easy because I've been a primary care doctor, and, you know, patients do read things on the internet and are pretty much assuming that they're going to have bad effects from statins. And what is our role as a health system, both on the clinical side, but on the kind of cost prudential side? How do we try to deal with that situation? It's not easy, don't get me wrong. It's very hard because we want to be sensitive and not kind of make patients all feel like we don't trust them or believe them. But all the cardiologists have had this over and over and over again in their practices. Dr. Varani, looks like you wanted to comment.
Yeah, I think I was going back to the point you were making about variation. So, we recently, just 2 days ago, published something related to this in a system as homogeneous as the Department of Veterans Affairs, right? Very homogeneous system. Even there, in terms of documentation of statin associated side effects, there's a 40 to 50% variation, even in a very homogeneous system. The one thing we learned from PCSK9 inhibitors was that criteria and definitions have to be consistent for clinicians to be able to use them. So as long as a lot of pharmacy benefit managers can come to a consensus as to what is that documentation that should look like, I think that's one piece that's going to be extremely helpful for clinicians and patients when it comes to the use of these medications and what that statin intolerance means. And I do agree that the societies also have to come to a consensus to have one clean definition of what that may look like. And then the pharmacy benefit managers will also, if they can all come together, so it's not different for a patient who's going to one clinician versus the other. If there's some homogeneous definition, I think it will help the clinicians a lot. And then I do agree with you that as clinicians, it's our responsibility as well to not find the easy way out, but talk to our patients and make sure what we know from a 35-year experience as therapy that works, that they are getting the most benefit out of that, but then be open with the idea that there are going to be patients who will truly need that. And it's not going to be a very small minority. It's a sizable 10, 20% of our patients who will end up being labeled as having statin associated side effects.
All right, thanks. I'm going to try to manage our last about 10, 15 minutes to get through a couple of other key points, one of which is the one that Kat raised. And then I want to move to step therapy, leaving some of the best to last, and talk a little bit about pricing. But there are other criteria that are embedded in these general terms of the label, one of which is clinically established ASCVD, is the way that, I think that was the way that PCSK9s were labeled, and bempedoic acid is established ASCVD. So Kat, were you wondering whether equivalents to ASCVD were going to be considered by payers, or how that ASCVD label is operationalized? Is that what your question was?
I think my question goes to what Dr. Varani just highlighted, and that is that I think when it comes to lipid management and in the ASCVD population, and also in the hopefully we're not going to leave out the primary prevention severe hypercholesterolemia population, our problem is under treatment. It's not over treatment. And what we saw with the advent of PCSK9 inhibitors was that there were barriers that got in the way of people getting treatment. And I think ironic that the conversation about ezetimibe being so underused, in my view, it was prior authed out of existence. And now we're upset that people are not on ezetimibe. So what I really hope is that we find a way with the advent of newer treatments to make it easier for the physician and for the patient and for the health system in a way that really makes the best use of our healthcare dollars. And I hope you heard me say clearly, first line is statin. Lots of people are going to do really well. We're not using them enough. Can we optimize statin therapy? And then can we facilitate, instead of put up barriers in the form of, documentation? We have payers that require genetic testing when LDL level, when the clinical diagnosis is clear. How can we make it easier and facilitate it and work together to get better outcomes instead of putting up these barriers? Because the thing we cannot afford is the underutilization of effective therapies.
Good point. Okay, so let's move into one last piece of the defining language, I guess. In the label, it says patients who need additional lowering of LDL. Now, again, we could assume that's up to the patient and the doctor to decide whether they need additional lowering, because some people will say lower is better. If you're at 50, go to 40. If you're at 70, go to 60. On the other hand, we have these thresholds also still for people with ASCVD, but now we have European guidelines that suggest a lower target. Those rabid, crazy Europeans who are always overtreating people want to get people to a lower cholesterol. So both clinical experts and payers, let's try to have a short conversation. What's going to happen? Are clinical docs going to say, my patient's at 70, he or she should be at 55 or 50. I want to add on inclisiran to my statin and bempedoic acid or whatever else they're on at the time, statin and ezetimibe. Are payers going to say, nope, they're at 70 and that's good enough for American doctors? So how do we work that part out? First of all, do we think many American doctors are going to ask for the next gun in the battle if the patient's below 70 or not?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Most doctors are fairly laissez-faire about risk factors in general. In the world of hypertension, it's called clinical inertia, where you look at the records and the person has been uncontrolled for years and with no upregulation of the blood pressure medicines. That's well documented in the literature. And I think it's the same for the LDL cholesterol that's above the recommended goal, and it remains that way without any intensification. I think if the LDL is fairly well controlled, most clinicians will just leave it alone.
Okay.
The paperwork that the managers, the clinical benefit managers put on clinicians is terrible. And the real truth, and I don't have data on this, but I know this because I've had thousands of patients. When ezetimibe was Zetia, we couldn't use it. When it became ezetimibe generic, we couldn't use it. In fact, many plans didn't even cover generic ezetimibe. And then they had to go through prior authorization. That went on for a good year or two. And now people are saying, why are you not using ezetimibe? CAP kind of hit at that. That's the real history with that. Doctors were berated, mainly doctors, because it's an old drug, were berated that they shouldn't be using this drug because we didn't have outcomes until the Improve It trial came out after 12 years of observation.
All right, so let's jump right to step therapy so we have a few good minutes to talk about it. It's the 800-pound gorilla in the room to a certain extent. I mean, there are other criteria, but we took a look and obviously, I mean, Eric told you that it's not a formal part of step therapy, but a wide variety of payers have some use required of ezetimibe, including Aetna, Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, Centene, Cigna. I could go on and on. And this is a change, as Dr. Ferdinand just mentioned and others have mentioned. So is it appropriate? I mean, we have statins as kind of a, and maximally tolerated statins. And we know that not many patients are on ezetimibe. But now ezetimibe is very inexpensive. It's part of clinical guidelines in the United States. There are outcomes data for it, and it's really a pretty safe drug. What are the pros and cons of having formal step therapy made part of the coverage policy here? Eric described how they did it. They look at the range that the patient needs to drop, and if it's within 25%, Eric, you do require them to have a trial of ezetimibe.
Correct.
So how do we view that as an appropriate way to manage this trade-off between cost and the need for patients to get where they want to get with their LDLs? Dr. Virani, let me invite you to answer first, because I know you were involved in the guidelines where ezetimibe kind of suddenly have a place of pride, if you will.
Sure. So, I mean, I want to be very clear here. These use are mine. These are not related to the guidelines per se. So please don't construe it as something coming from the guideline panel. But I think that the thing to consider here is that yes, we get a mean LDL cholesterol reduction of, in Improve It trial, it was 23-24%. Some will argue it's 18 to 20%, but let's just for the sake of discussion, secondary prevention population, which was an Improve It, about 23-24% LDL cholesterol reduction. That was the mean LDL cholesterol reduction. So there are some patients who get more than that. There are some, unfortunately, who get less than that. Now, of course, the argument that is mostly made is that in PCSK9 inhibitor trials, we had 3 to 5%. Well, a counter argument could be made that this was not an exclusion either, right? So if you are going to use a therapy, you will also always go by, you have clinical efficacy data for ezetimibe, you have clinical outcomes data for ezetimibe. It's the same argument you have for statin therapy. Why would you not maximize statin therapy? Now, if you have another therapy that you can maximize that actually is generic now, let's face it, it improves clinical outcomes, it gives you a decent LDL cholesterol reduction, then why not basically try that first? Now, the US guidelines, that's why, had a recommendation that they would recommend, not mandate, but recommend. Those are recommendations that we try that out first. But then if you look at that same algorithm, there is a box on the side that a clinician could go directly to PCSK9 inhibitors if they wanted to, right? There is a box there. It's not recommended, but you could directly if you wanted to after talking to the patient. That option is there, but it would make more intuitive sense that you would go through the ezetimibe route. It's not like you're not giving any therapy to the patient. You are giving a therapy and then measuring an impact very quickly in 4 to 6 weeks. So that was one of the reasons that step therapy was a recommendation in the guidelines. And actually, if we look at even the European guidelines, we think that they are very aggressive. Even the European guidelines actually recommend a stepwise approach right now. So those were some of that was the thinking behind it. Mm-hmm. And it's different than saying don't do anything. You are actually adding a therapy that does improve cardiovascular outcomes. So just wanted to mention that was the thinking behind some of those recommendations that we saw in the guidelines.
Steve, can I ask, so I as I said, my LDL starts at 360. On 40 of rosuvastatin and 10 of ezetimibe, I got my best numbers ever last month, LDL of 82. So some people are like that. Other people will be twice as high as I am on those therapies, and they're going to need something else. The physicians should be following the clinical guidelines. The guidelines are meant for the physicians, but some people are waiting a year to go see their physician. So you're going to go see your physician, try one statin. Maybe they want you to raise the statin. You have to go back to the physician. Requiring it from an insurance standpoint is a barrier to care. I hope the physicians do it and the nurse practitioners who really do such a stellar job of managing hypercholesterolemia too. But I really wish that we wouldn't create more barriers to people getting to their cholesterol goals.
Pat, how do you balance though? I mean, I could say, don't worry about statins. You might get muscles and you might call me in the morning and it's a real hassle. Just take this PCSK9 that I can administer you here in the office. Come back and see me in 6 months. You'd come anyway. I mean, how do we balance against the slippery slope towards that? I hear what you're saying, that a bad health system and a badly managed insurance system can create unbelievable hassles.
But we have 30 years. I mean, what we tell people, because we talk to people all day, every day,
yeah.
We have like an anti-vax equivalent in the cholesterol and statin world that we're working against. And I know Andrea and I work every day against those perceptions. People would like to skip the statin. We have 35 years of data on hundreds of thousands of people, I think. I mean, we just say people, this is where we've got the most evidence that it's gonna help. And then we have these other great options that you add on unless you cannot take a statin. And yeah, you should go ahead and do the ezetimibe. It's great for a lot of people, but if insurance plans are going to create another, I agree with, I think statins is solidly recommended by all the guidelines and in the FDA indication that statins are the first line baseline. But why create more barriers from the side of the insurance? Why can't the physicians and the nurse practitioners, hopefully follow the guidelines and do that? But if they need to get straight to another therapy, I wish there wouldn't be a barrier.
So is that a counter? So Steve, how would you answer the people who say, and if done that way, we're going to stay at 5% ezetimibe use, and insurance has a role to play in trying to maximize the cost effectiveness of the system, because left to their own devices, doctors don't bear the financial risk, and so we might stay at 5% ezetimibe use.
I mean, patients bear some. I know people in Medicare, I heard from somebody yesterday paying $400 out of pocket every month for his PCSK9 inhibitor. I can guarantee you he's going to try the ezetimibe. But I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, but I think that we're not giving doctors enough credit. I don't think that maybe I'm wrong, I don't think there's a huge sweeping amount of cardiologists or doctors who are just going to go for a PCSK9 or the brand new shiny object just because they can. I mean, the statins have been proven and they know that they work. And, you know, we added ezetimibe, and that, you know, the doctors are going to follow, for the most part, the sequence of what they're supposed to do. I think when we add the barriers to step therapy and we keep adding more, you have to do this and then you do that, I think what we're doing is creating barriers, and patients aren't getting the care they need because of those barriers.
Help us if we, I mean, any form of step therapy could obviously be called a barrier. It's an extra step to take. Is it the way that it's being administered that we could create a best practice around? Because if trying it and it doesn't get you to your LDL, and then that allows you to get the next treatment, help understand the in a sense, the administrative burden that's the barrier versus other things that are the barrier here. Because maybe there's a way for us to send a signal of how to do it right, because we're creating a barrier with statins, right? We're creating a barrier, but everybody's okay with that one.
I think that if we could have a system, and this is like a pie in the sky, amazing, perfect healthcare system, to where it was all the same across the board. So whether you have Blue Cross Blue Shield, you have United, you have you know, Medicaid, you have Medicare, this is the way it works. What happens now is that patients are confused. Patients have no idea what they need to do to get this medication. Doctors' offices are overwhelmed with paperwork and administrative work to get patients the medications they need. I've been confused myself, and I'm pretty educated in the healthcare system. I ended up paying $160 for a prescription because I didn't do whatever I was supposed to do to get some benefit card. And I was just like, I'm just going to pay it because I don't want to go home. So, but what if I didn't have that money and I didn't understand the system and I didn't, you know, those are the barriers that we're creating when everybody just makes up their own rules about not covering medications. The second piece, and I'm sorry, I'll stop after this one, is once you've been approved for a therapy, you've gone through the steps of the therapy, you should be able to have that medication and not have to have another prior authorization every 2 months or every month or every 3 months, because then it's multiple calls to the doctors, multiple calls to the pharmacist, insurance companies, when you've already been approved. So I think streamlining the process would be a huge help.
All right. We have this on record and we're going to capture a lot of that. Kat also knows that we've worked with a multi-stakeholder group on trying to figure out what criteria we could come up with that would help us judge whether step therapy would be fair in certain circumstances. And it's all well and good unless it's administered poorly. And the administration that you just closed with there is a key part of whether any kind of step therapy could be envisioned as being appropriate, because the barrier just augments. And we heard Dr. Baum talk about it. We heard others on the public comments today. All right, I'm looking at the time and I'm gonna skip some of the issues that we'll still include in our policy recs because it's come up in other conversations, often with you and earlier around the research that we might need going forward, around adherence, other things. But I want to close with an issue around the pricing, just because we still have one price that's yet to be determined. First, I hope that Mike Louie has appreciated the whole process, and I know that his company's been very thoughtful and has had, criticisms of our approach to the modeling, but that the idea of trying to scale the price to the relative benefits to patients is something that they take seriously. And we were using the federal supply schedule price, so we'll have to wait to see how the negotiated price turns out in the marketplace. But for inclisiran, you guys are still tabula rasa. Your CEO has said we're going to price it approximately in the cost-effective range, which was already kind of broad, if you will, several hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in a certain way. On the other hand, Wall Street analysts were really worried. And I'll just read you something that they said earlier this year. This asset came to Novartis through a $9.7 billion acquisition. And Wall Street assumes that you need $2.2 billion peak sales in order to make that price make sense. And the current global use of all PCSK9s, both combined, is 1 billion. And Wall Street thinks you need to make 2.2 billion on inclisiran. How do you get there? Do you charge a higher price? Do you assume that primary prevention is the only way out of this box for you as a company? I know I'm asking you some important questions that you may not be able to give too much detail to, but I'm hoping that the pricing decisions that your company takes obviously will advance the cause of access that is really driving the concerns from the patient community, the clinician community. And yet Wall Street says you got to make a lot of money on this thing. So how's it going to work?
Yeah, so Steve, being on the medical side of our organization, I fortunately don't have to solve those issues on a day-to-day basis, but I can tell you that Novartis is committed to responsible value-based pricing and strongly advocates for US access models that are centered on value-based pricing in return for fair, affordable, and sustainable patient access. And I think that does take a lot of collaboration across many stakeholders in order to make that model work. That's why we appreciate the collaboration that we're having here with ICER and with this, with the experts on this panel, to be able to assess our innovative therapies in the right way. And that's how the organization is really going to determine pricing.
I know that's, I hope you guys all heard the way that David worded that, because it is something that Novartis is very strong on, I would say, as far as a culture, as it's expressed publicly from their CEO and other places. They want to be the best company in a future in which pricing is aligned to value, to support their innovative approach. And I know that can still make people squint and talk about what value is and how we all line things up. But since you guys are next up with the pricing in this space, know that I'm sure the patient community and clinician community, and certainly from ICER's perspective, we look forward and hope that you can follow through on pricing that will really advance access, because patients need more choices, as we've all heard today. Let me invite the policy roundtable to pause for a second and to think of a closing statement that you can make in one sentence. This is the last unfair thing I'll do today, is to ask you to make a one-sentence closing statement that is as succinct as possible. It's something, a theme that you want to really hit hard one last time, a request of one of the other stakeholders at this roundtable or elsewhere that would make the world a better place in the most kind of tangible fashion. And we'll do this and then allow the CEPAC to join me in thanking you and move to their comments. But I'd like to end with the patients here. And so let me start, if I could, with the drug makers. And Michael, go back to you. So a closing sentence, if you would, please.
Steve, I'd just like to say our team has really appreciated the very collegial interactions that we've had with the ICER team. I think we've been collaborative in terms of trying to get to the right answers here, and it's been a pleasure. I guess the one thing I would say in terms of change is it's been acknowledged that really ICER has to deal with the average patient rather than individual patients in terms of applying policy across different groups. And I hope that we can work to figure out how to incorporate, the ability to account for patient differences beyond what's the average.
Okay, thank you very much. David.
Thanks, Steve, for the opportunity to join. So, I'm surprised. We did talk earlier about the fact that cardiovascular death is the #1 cause of death in the US. I think what maybe we didn't talk about enough is the fact that those rates in the US, after declining for decades, are actually now plateaued or going up in the wrong direction. And when you look at the patients with ASCVD who are on statins, only 80% of them are actually achieving their guideline recommended LDL goal of 70 milligrams per deciliter. And all of that tells me, and I think it hopefully tells the community, that we do need additional treatment innovations to address that gap right there. And so I think that's what this discussion is about as well, and how we best leverage those treatment innovations to help patients.
All right, thanks. Eric.
Thanks, Steve. I mean, I've had the opportunity to participate in a few of these, and they've always been educational. This one's no different. I just want to thank all of the patients who gave their stories and all the people that worked on the model and the report, both this one and the historical reports in this disease state, because I feel like the work that's been done here has definitely influenced and increased discussions on value of healthcare. And I think that it's, we see that, and I want to comment on, something I heard earlier, that there was an accusation that ICER reports restricted access and restricted policies to patients for other agents in this class. And I would say that is definitely not the case. Policies are drafted based on clinical evidence and guidelines. And I would say that since the evolution of your reports, access has been lifted. We've had over 400% more utilizers of PCSK9 since the first iteration of your report. So look forward to discussions like this. Only increases access for patients. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks very much. David Bush.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to everyone. I think there are disparities in healthcare. I think every American deserves access into healthcare, and it needs to be affordable. And as we go through this, it's it's everybody's responsibility to make this work. And I think sometimes we're looked at as creating barriers, but I think we're really trying to create the right access for the right people at the right time. But make no doubt about it, there are disparities in healthcare, and we just need to make it more affordable.
Okay, thank you, David. Dr. Virani.
First of all, thank you for this great learning opportunity. I would say it's great to learn from patients, pharmacy benefit managers, the drug makers as well. It's a great dialogue, and I hope that even when decisions are made after that, it's a very long road for clinicians and patients to actually get the medications that the patients deserve. So having these conversations and dialogue, even after those decisions are made, I think will be very helpful to not just set up a process, but then making sure that those processes are working and not creating barriers for clinicians and patients would be a very humble request if that is something that can be done on a continual basis.
It's an interesting idea. We'll have to think about that. I think there's some definite thinking that I think that we would want to put into that. Thanks. Dr. Ferdinand.
Thank you for the opportunity. I wish going forward that as we have new therapies, that we not allow that to expand the disparities, but to decrease them. Cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death in the United States. The racial ethnic barriers to outcomes are baked in. It's been persistent and it's getting worse. So when we have these new therapies, we have to build into education, public education, patient education, and access, or we will have the unintended consequence of creating even more disparities.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, Andrea?
Thank you. I just want to say thank you all for having this robust conversation, and it's been great to learn from each other. I echo what Dr. Virani said, that it's wonderful to be able to be together and have the conversation from different aspects. And I hope that in the future there are more conversations like this. Just a reminder that, and I was the one who said innovation means nothing if we don't get access to the patients. And I think that everybody is trying really hard. I don't think it's anybody's fault. I think it's a broken system that we're all trying to work within. But I really want to make sure that the patient and their physician is at the center of this decision, and through shared decision making, that they can determine and follow guidelines that's best for them, and make that decision to get the medications that they need without undue barriers.
Great, thank you very much. And Kat?
Thanks so much. I would really like to thank ICER. I know we've been working together since 2015, and the first PCSK9 report came out. To thank your team and to the Midwest CEPAC and the Policy Roundtable participants. It's really been a terrific experience. I think it's an example of really what I would hope for, is that we all work together in the same direction for, as I think Dave said, the right thing, the right treatment for the right patient at the right time. We all need to be good stewards of not only our health, but our healthcare dollars. And we have an opportunity. I think that's the exciting thing in cardiovascular disease. While we're headed in the wrong direction, right? We have these amazing tools that they don't even have in other disease states. So we could bend that curve back if we can focus on secondary prevention, and I hope also primary prevention, to lower the rates of cardiovascular disease and really save entire families from the devastating effects. So that's my hope, and it's an invitation for anybody we'd love to work closely with payers and to really find a way to optimize the approach.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to do the traditional Zoom applause, which is to thank all of you again, because you've all just been brilliant in bringing your experience, your perspectives, and a lot of lessons that we will try to synthesize and to get into some of our recommendations. But you've just set a great example too for, as Kat said and others, how we need to come together and how we can try to talk through these issues, because I really do think we all see the right future together. We just have to figure out how to get there, and it's always going to include some compromises and trade-offs. But today's roundtable is a great way, I think, to frame the issue for a lot of stakeholders who will hear about this through the meeting or read the report later. So on behalf of all of the CEPAC, thank you guys very much. Now I want to turn it to the CEPAC, and I've left you guys, I'm afraid, with less time to make your final comments. So in addition to it being one sentence or less, whatever that means, if you can make it as brief as possible, we know that some people will need to leave right at the hour. I'm just going to go, I'll go ahead and do this quickly for Reem, but I'll just go quickly by the folks that I see in front of me, and I'll end up with Reem at the end. So let me start with Nick Bagley.
Nick, you're muted.
Oh, Nick, you unmuted yourself, but we're not hearing you. So let's come back to you in a second. Rachel, let me try Rachel.
Okay, I'm so honored and thankful that everyone joined us today. As usual, I want to thank everyone for engaging with the work. And I just particularly wanted to thank Dr. Ferdinand and Dr. Virani for their attention to the systemic inequities that are particularly acute in this context, more so than some others we've discussed, and how those have impacted our thinking over the course of the day. Thanks, Rachel. Nick, you want to give another shot, or are you still? I'm afraid we're still, whatever system problem we have, I'm afraid it's still going. If you are on CEPAC, go ahead and turn on your camera so I know that you're ready to make your comment. Bijan?
Yeah, hi. I truly appreciate ISER and all the participants today for giving me this opportunity to be part of the meeting that discuss in a very honorable way the pros and cons of these three new drugs. And as always, it was insightful to hear the perspective from all the stakeholders, particularly the patient and patient representatives, stakeholders. It was really insightful for me. And it seems we all seem to agree that there are, we still lack long-term studies, and hopefully this ISER report as well as long-term studies will determine the uptake of these drugs, like these new drugs. And I'm kind of really proud to be part of that process. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Brad.
I guess my thoughts are on that was mentioned earlier in starting to look at maybe different patient groups. When I look at the long-term modeling results, I couldn't help but to think that our long-term cost effectiveness might be different when we looked at starting 50-year-olds versus 60-year-olds and 70-year-olds that were included in the model. And I think that estimate was justified for that one, but I think for health plans, they might be thinking about that don't have a Part D coverage, and they're looking at 50-year-olds. The average age might be 55-year-olds for people that had previous ACD, that we might get different answers on long-term cost effectiveness for those groups.
Interesting idea. Thank you. Going around, Don Casey.
Thanks a lot. This was great. So a request to the manufacturers and researchers to evaluate the utility of patient-reported outcomes for subpopulations, and also to invest in developing resources for shared decision-making that is culturally sensitive, especially for those experiencing health inequities.
Thank you, Don. Jill?
Just want to thank you guys for including me, and I'm hopeful that the drugs will remain and emerge to be priced by manufacturers that align with the value. I'm hopeful.
That's great. Thanks very much. I've got Scott.
Thanks, everyone. Much appreciated, ICER, for convening such a great panel. I learned much from everyone. And, speaking to Dr. Virani and clinical practice guidelines, hopefully that patient perspective becomes even more apparent in future iterations, along with all of the patient inequities that we talked about. I think those are, not as apparent as they need to be in clinical practice guidelines, and they help all of us clinicians, pharmacists, nurse practitioners, and so on. Those are the most widely read documents, in addition to the ICER statement. If those perspectives can get in there, we'll go a long way to making change.
Thanks a lot. Stacy?
I think one of the things that I appreciated so much about this meeting was, obviously saying there's some groups of patients who could really benefit from these treatment options. And so I think looking for opportunities to better target the drugs to patients who really need them, and then make sure that patients can afford them, is really important. And also, thank you so much for the patients who came and gave and shared their stories. They were perfect examples of people who I think would benefit from these types of treatments. So thank you all for such a great report and a great meeting.
Thanks, Stacy. Aaron?
I don't think I have much to add above what everyone has said, other than to repeat my thanks to everyone who's participated and my gratitude that meetings in a public way like this exist.
Thank you very much. Albert?
Yes, thank you to everyone, especially the patients. I just want to say something that has been hinted at, which is we talked a lot about the lack of delivery of existing therapies like statins, that there are populations that are not reached. What this venue doesn't do is we don't formally evaluate the value of improving delivery of existing therapies. If we did that, what would we find? How would it compare to the value of a new therapy? We just always talk about the newest therapy, but there is incredible value potentially of improving delivery of existing drugs like statins, which are already generic. So that's just something to think about. Can we do both improve delivery of existing therapies and innovate at the same time? I'll end on a very capitalist note, which is that if we do have all these new drugs, perhaps there's more competition, and perhaps prices will go down. Maybe patients will have more choice, and we'll have our cake and eat it too.
Thanks very much. Ingve?
Yes, thanks so much. This was a great session. It's an honor to be on the panel. Judging net health benefits is always tough, right? And I think this is a particular good example that we had to make extrapolations on the benefits, on the harms, and the resulting net benefits. Modeling introduces additional uncertainties because of the assumptions. So I'm very much looking forward to the final trials that can give us some final health outcomes so that we can be more certain about the benefits.
Oh no, then we'll just have more to argue about. Alan?
Yeah, I appreciate what Kat said about wouldn't it be ideal if there was more standardization of how the guidelines are implemented across payers. I understand that's probably not going to happen anytime in the near future. And it may, as another suggestion to think about, in this, based on the spirit of collaboration in which this meeting was held, and that ICER, I think, has done such an incredible job of promoting that. As you're seeing more and more therapies come into this space of LDL lowering and managed secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease, I think there's a real opportunity to come together as multiple stakeholders and think about how do you create, and this builds on a point that somebody else just made, and I apologize, I missed the name, of how do you really get the right care to the right patient at a time? How do you use this arsenal in the most appropriate way for the most appropriate patients? And it ultimately comes down not to necessarily standardizing the clinical, the implementation of clinical guidelines and formularies, but actually what you could standardize is the shared decision-making process. that maximize the likelihood that the right patient is going to get to whatever tool is right for them, particularly when you've got different modes of administration. And I cannot, based on an organization that every day helps patients with transportation, food, housing, access to care based on affordability, you know, the difference between a pill monthly and an at-home injection daily versus a twice a year in-office injection, you know, how those unique features benefit patients differently is really important. There's not one answer or one mode of administration that's going to be best for each patient. So just that variability alone, I think, is enough justification to really not necessarily not try to standardize, you know, what's the next step, but actually empower patients and their care team to figure out what's the best next step. You know, there's nothing wrong with step therapy theoretically, but the application of it really should be based on what's the next best step for that patient. And I think properly empowered, the care team and the patient can really make a fiscally sound and steward that decision in a way that actually saves the system money and maximizes adherence and gets to the best outcome.
Thanks very much, Alan. And now I can hand it back to Reem. Sorry, Nick, we'll have to get you next time around, but Reem, your final statement?
Sure. Nick added his thanks to everybody and he was wishing for outcome data. So thank you, Nick. Well, I want to kind of my final statement would be to highlight this is such an important condition and it especially affects our underserved and a diverse group of patients. And in an area where unfortunately existing issues around access for effective treatment. Statin is one of the very few treatments that actually have high certainty data over years and years, and we still have not figured out how to have effective system to deliver it to everybody. So we have this challenge and obligation of maximizing access and at the same time maximizing efficacy of our healthcare system, supporting innovation, without creating barriers to get it to our patients. But I do think this is exactly the kind of dialogue that will help us get there. And I thank everybody, especially our patients and clinical experts who truly spent time not only working with patients, but trying to move the needle forward. I want to thank the report team, both the effectiveness and modeling. So thank you very much for all the hard work and the excellent report that you put together. And I want to thank ICER for bringing us together, our my fellow CEPAC members. And Steve, I want to thank you for not shying away from asking the hard questions. We very much appreciate that. So thank you all.
Thank you. It's actually harder to ask hard questions when you're not in the room with people because you just feel that slight, you know, ickier about putting them on the spot. But thank you. So we're over time by a minute or two, but I will also quickly thank folks, especially, again, the clinical experts who's put in lots of time helping us understand this field in many different ways. The patient representatives, the relationship extends far beyond the contours of the 8 months that we spent to a broader view of the landscape and what we need to do together to get things right. And again, without your input to help us ground it in what is important to the patient, we wouldn't really be on any kind of firm ground going forward. So thank you to all the folks and to the payers and to the drug makers who came to participate in the public discussion. Again, not always easy to answer these questions, but really important for the public to hear you and how you think through these things. And so we really appreciate that. I just have two final things to close with. One is this topic really highlights the tension between the big population, and it's big, people who have high cholesterol, and subpopulations who are so different, one from each other and from the average patient, that, again, that unicorn that doesn't exist. And we talk about averages for a variety of reasons, partly because there will be one price for these drugs in our system, but it makes it really important that everybody from patients to doctors to drug makers and payers understand the diversity of the experience. And that can be by their clinical severity, it can be by where they live and how they receive their care. And I think we've hoped to bring a lot of transparency to the thinking around those issues because the cost effectiveness results really differ by subpopulation. And people need to know that as much as what the average number is. The second is that this is one of ICER's kind of foundational areas, because we recognize that the system ground to a halt with the launch of the PCSK9s. The price and the access failed patients, utterly failed them, and it made life miserable for clinicians. And I don't think it was good for anybody. And whether we've come to a better place or not, we may soon figure out. But everybody's been saying, let's just not have a repeat of that. And so my final takeaway is that I hope, because I think it's just intuitively true, but price and access are so linked. And the way that we think about what a fair price is and what fair access is have to travel together, because we're never going to get one without the other. And I think, as David Platt said, they do need to sit together in people's minds. So we need to think about them, talk about them as supporting each other, and we need to work on both. So the fact that we can talk about price as a conduit to fair access, but it's not a guarantee of it. We need to keep the pressure on the whole system to make sure that those two things are baked in. And if we get that right, I'm convinced we will have future innovation as well. So let's hope for that future together. Thank you for everybody's participation. Be safe. We're getting closer and closer to the time when I can say that the next time the Midwest CEPAC will meet, it will be in person. I'm not sure we're quite there yet, but please take care of yourselves and everybody around you, and we'll get there soon enough. Thank you again for everybody's participation, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.